This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Bloomburrow, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and in this video I'm continuing with my Bloomburrow Limited set review. So far I've looked at all the multicolored, colorless white and blue cards. In this video we're looking at black. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review cards in this video. First, because we're only talking about draft and sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video. Play boosters in this set do have special guests, but I'll be talking about those in a later video. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, since the goal is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some things, but as the format comes into focus, I'll do videos updating my thoughts on the format. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at all the black cards in Bloomburrow. First up, it's Agate Blade Assassin, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/3 Lizard Assassin at common. When it attacks, defending player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is a pretty solid card, even in a vacuum. Sometimes attacking with a 1/3 is possible, but not worth it because your opponent has a 2/2 that can block it. But this assassin makes it worth attacking in those situations, and it helps you trigger all the black-red stuff in the format that gives you bonuses for having your opponent lose life, and it works nicely in black-white, which likes to gain life, so this looks like a solid 2-drop overall, giving it a C. Next up, it's Bandit's Talent, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment class. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards 2 cards unless they discard a non-land card. Because it's a class, you can also pay costs to level it up to level 2 and level 3. You can pay these costs at sorcery speed. You can pay 1 black, and at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, they lose 2 life. And you can pay 3 generic and a black to get it to level 3. And at the beginning of your draw step, you draw an additional card for each opponent who has 1 or fewer cards in hand. This looks pretty good. You get decent value from the discard effect up front, whether they discard 2 or 1 card. It's a bit of a bummer. There are 2 graveyard decks in the format, so you might accidentally help them, but it will be good more often than not. Then later in the game, it can draw you cards and legitimately pressure your opponent. This is a lot of value on 1 card, I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Bonebind Orator, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 Squirrel Warlock Bard at common. You can pay 3 generic and a black and exile it from your graveyard to return another target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. A 2-mana 2/2 is pretty bad in today's Limited, and while this does do something out of the graveyard, it's super expensive and only the kind of thing that becomes useful in the late game when you have nothing better to do. Blue-black and green-black are definitely graveyard decks, but the latter is likely to exile cards from the graveyard a lot, so having extra graveyard value stuff doesn't seem that valuable. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Bone Cache Overseer, which for 1 black is a 1/1 Squirrel Warlock at uncommon. You can tap it and pay a life to draw a card, activate only if 3 or more cards left your graveyard this turn or if you sacrificed a food this turn. I like this. There's plenty of food and forage support in the format, and this is definitely a premium payoff, as drawing cards can really overwhelm your opponent. I also like that sacrificing food the old-fashioned way lets you use it too. I do think this needs a build-around grade, because if you're not in black-green, you probably just can't play it. But if you are, it's one of the premium payoffs for your deck. It's probably a D in your typical black deck in the format, but a B in black-green. Next up, it's Coiling Rebirth, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. It says gift a card. That means you can promise an opponent a gift as you cast this, and if you do, they draw a card before its other effects. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, then if the gift was promised and that creature isn't legendary, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's 1/1. 5 mana reanimation spells that only target your own graveyard basically never perform well. It's just too much mana, and you need something in the graveyard that's worth it, and things just don't line up that way very often. This tries to mitigate against that a little bit, since if you give your opponent a card, you get a 1/1 copy of the creature you reanimate, but I'm skeptical that will be worth giving your opponent a card most of the time. I mean, if you're getting a creature with a good enter the battlefield ability or powerful static ability, it's probably going to be worth it, but the typical thing you get back is far from guaranteed to be worth a card. I think this is probably just a D. Next up, it's Consumed by Greed, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon instant. It says gift a card. It says target opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures they control. If the gift was promised, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This looks like a great uncommon. I'm usually pretty happy with a 3 mana instant that likely kills my opponent's best creature, so the gift upside is awesome on top of that. There's a good chance the card you get back from your graveyard will be better than a random card from your opponent's deck, so you definitely come out ahead. Although you need to do a risk-benefit analysis every time you cast this, because if you're just getting back like a random 2-drop, it might not be worth it. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Cruel Claw's Heist, which for 2 black mana is a rare sorcery with gift a card. Target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, exile that card. If the gift was promised, you may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled, and mana of any type can be spent to cast it. If you decide to give your opponent a card with this, they get it before the effect resolves, so you can make them exile the card you give them, and because you get to cast the card you steal, you're effectively drawing a card too, so it isn't card disadvantage even when you do give them the card. 2 black to make them discard a non-land as a baseline isn't too bad either, but you're going to gift a card to your opponent more often than not when you cast this, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Dagger Fang Duo, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 rat squirrel at common. It's got Death Touch, and when it enters, you can mill 2 cards. A 3 mana 3/2 Death Touch is not the most exciting thing. It can trade for anything, but on a card that costs 3 mana, the value of that goes down precipitously. However, both black and green are graveyard decks that will be pretty happy to mill 2, so I think this is a C. Next up, it's Dark Star Augur, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 bat warlock. At rare, it's got Offspring, and that means you can pay an additional cost as you cast it to make a 1/1 token copy of it. In this case, that additional cost is a single black mana. It's got flying, and at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library and put that card into your hand. You lose life equal to its mana value. This is really good. You can draw 2 extra cards a turn with the Offspring, which is really efficiently costed. I'd already be reasonably happy to spend 4 mana for a 2/3 flyer and a 1/1 flyer, by the way, but you also get this ability every upkeep. You do need to be a little bit careful to not have a really high curve if you're going to be playing Dark Star Augur, because things can go bad, but you're likely to hit lands a decent chunk of the time and cheap cards a decent chunk of the time, and there's a lot of life gain in black in this set too. So I think the downside of this card is sort of mitigated by the format itself. You do need to build your deck with it in mind a little bit, but I don't think it's to such a degree it needs a build around grade or anything. It's just going to be nuts in like every deck. It's a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Dire Sight, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. Surveil 2, then draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life. This can put 3 cards into your graveyard for foraging, while also giving you a 2-for-1, and when all of that lines up perfectly, it'll probably feel kind of close to a 3-for-1. Still, it's a sorcery that doesn't impact the board and makes you lose life, something that can be pretty scary in a format that looks reasonably aggressive. It's probably just a C. Next up, it's Downwind Ambusher, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/2 skunk assassin at uncommon with flash. When it enters, you choose one. Target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. This is probably the best card we've ever seen with the destroy target creature that's been damaged effect. Of course, that's because it also has another option. Being able to flash this in and pick off an X1 or ambush block a weakened creature is awesome. Normally, the destroyed target creature that's damaged thing is underwhelming because you usually have to use a card or some other resource to do that damage, but this can do something even when you can't, and it's also got a better stat line than most creatures with this effect. And it still has all the upside of being able to destroy damaged creatures when you block them with a token and stuff like that too, giving this a B-. Next up, it's Early Winter, which for 4 generic and a black is a common instant. Choose one, exile target creature, or target opponent exiles an enchantment they control. 5 mana to exile a creature is just not very good these days. It's just tough to get anything close to mana equity when you're spending that much. The enchantment mode is upside, but not really enough for this to be anywhere close to remotely premium, or even a card that's always going to make the cut. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Feed the Cycle, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you can forage or pay 1 black mana. To forage, you either exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food, destroy target creature, or planeswalker. So the floor here is murder that can also hit planeswalkers. That planeswalker part doesn't matter much in limited, but it's a thing. And that's a pretty solid removal spell. But you'll also pay 2 for this regularly. Foraging is kind of automatic by the late game for any deck, not just a black-green deck. And you're likely to be able to get it going early if you are in black-green because you probably have a food lying around, so this is just great removal, giving it a B. Next up, it's Fell, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery that says destroy target creature. This is nice and simple, and I think pretty darn good. 2 mana to take down any creature is a great deal even at sorcery speed. Trading up will be no problem. It's definitely premium because it's so efficient and it can hit any creature. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Glide Dive Duo, which for 4 generic and a black is a 3/3 bat lizard. A common, it's got flying. When it enters, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Life Drain always plays fairly well in Limited, so adding a real flying body to the board and making a gap of 4 life between you and your opponent is definitely worth 5 mana, especially because, like the other duos, this has 2 useful creature types and does something useful for both the Bat deck and the Lizard deck, because the Lizard deck likes it when your opponent loses life, and the Bat deck likes it when you gain life. It is a 5-drop though, and most of the time you don't want a whole lot of them. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Hazel's Nocturne, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon instant. Return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. I like this. I'm always a fan of having one of these kinds of effects in black decks in Limited. By that I mean a card that gets you 2 creatures back from the graveyard. In other words, a 2-for-1. The best ones tend to cost 3 mana, but most of them are also sorceries, and most of them also don't drain life. The life drain is legit too, because it means this card kind of impacts the board, as creating a gap of 4 life between you and your opponent goes a long way towards making the game go long enough for you to take advantage of the cards you got back. It also means it triggers stuff in the black-white and the black-red deck, of course. You probably still don't want more than one of these, but I think the first copy should be valued as a C+. Next up, it's Huskburster Swarm, which for 7 generic and a black is a 6/6 elemental insect at uncommon. It costs 1 generic less to cast for each creature card you own in exile and in your graveyard, and it's got Menace and Death Touch. Menace, Death Touch, and huge size go really well together, since your opponent can virtually never find a way not to get 2-for-1 when they block this, and sometimes it'll be even worse than that, and it's just huge. That said, this does need a build around grade because it's going to be good in black-green and blue-black, but kind of bad elsewhere. It is nice, it counts exiled creatures, so that means if you forage them away, you still get a cost reduction on the Huskburster. And casting it for 4 on 5 in those decks seems realistic, but not really anywhere else. So it's probably a D+ in a lot of black decks in the format, but a B- in both blue-black and black-green. Next up, it's Iridescent Vine Lasher, which for 1 black mana is a 1/2 Lizard Assassin at rare with Offspring for 2 generic, and it has Landfall. This creature deals 1 damage to target opponent. 3 mana for a 1/2 and a 1/1 that both have this Landfall trigger is a good deal. Just playing the front side isn't too bad either, though I think most of the time you're going to try and wait until you can Offspring it. There isn't a massive Landfall theme in the set, so really finding ways to abuse this trigger seem a little hard, but it does work well in the Lizard decks, which again, like it when you damage your opponent, giving this a B-. Next up, it's Maha, it's Feathers Knight. It's 3 generic and 2 black for a 6/5 legendary elemental bird at Mythic Rare. It's got flying and trample and ward, discard a card, and creatures your opponents control have base toughness 1. I love the art on this. The original Baleful Strix is one of my favorite magic arts, and this looks a lot like it. Anyway, it's also an insane card. A 5 mana 6/5 with flying and trample can end the game quickly, and even if your opponent finds a way to kill it, they have to 2-for-1 themselves. So if we just stop there, it would probably be a bomb or at least a B+, because it's like a 2-for-1 at worst. Then, lowering all of your opponent's creatures to 1 toughness is awesome, as it now means they are horrible at both blocking and attacking in most cases, and it also means Maha's trample becomes way more relevant. This is a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Moonstone Harbinger, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/3 Bat Warrior at uncommon. It's got flying and Death Touch. Whenever you gain or lose life during your turn, bats you control get +1/+0 and gain Death Touch until end of turn. This ability triggers only once each turn. That gain or lose life trigger is pretty good, and you're pretty likely to have 1 or 2 other bats around, and even just buffing the Harbinger isn't too shabby. Obviously, it already has Death Touch, but it will become a 2/3. A 3 mana 1/3 with flying and Death Touch isn't a disaster either. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Nocturnal Hunger, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant with Gift of Food. Destroy target creature. If the gift wasn't promised, you lose 2 life. 2 generic and a black to kill something at instant speed and lose 2 life is probably a C+. I mean, it kills anything, and it's relatively easy to cast, unlike Murder, which has double black in its cost, so it's better than Murder. Like, I'd be happy to lose 2 life in exchange for that second black pip most of the time in Limited. But you also have this Gift of Food option, like if you can't afford to pay the life, you can give your opponent a food. Most of the time, it's probably better to lose the life than it is to give your opponent the food, because They can gain 3 life off of the food, so like the net difference in your life totals ultimately is higher if you give them the food, although they do have to pay mana for it, but there's also all kinds of synergistic things they could do with it. So mostly, this is just 3 mana, destroy target creature, you lose 2 life, and I think throwing in the food upside, that makes this a B-. Next up, it's Osteomancer Adept, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 Squirrel Warlock at rare. It's got Death Touch. Until end of turn, you may cast creature spells from your graveyard by foraging in addition to paying their other costs. If you cast a spell this way, that creature enters with a finality counter on it. This has a solid baseline as a 2 mana 2/2 Death Touch, and being able to cast creatures with forage is pretty sweet. If you're mostly relying on your graveyard for forage in this case, it's going to be a little tricky to do it a lot, but being able to sacrifice food for the cost makes it really strong. And either way, even if you only ever cast a single card with this, it'll feel good, and sometimes it can generate insane value, especially late, giving it a B. Next up, it's Persistent Marsh Stalker, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/1 Rat Berserker at uncommon. It gets +1/+0 for each other rat you control, and it has Threshold. Whenever you attack with 1 or more rats, if 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, that's the threshold part, you may pay 2 generic and a black, and if you do, you return Persistent Marsh Stalker from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking. So this will often be a 4/1 or bigger, which means it can hit hard as an attacker and trade pretty well as a blocker. It does die to like 1 mana removal, but at 2 mana, that's not the biggest problem, especially because you can get it back in the late game and it can just be swinging really hard when you do, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Psychic Whirl, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. Target opponent discards 2 cards, then if you control a rat, surveil 2. So this is Mind Rot with rat upside, and if you can trigger the surveil, you can put 3 cards in your graveyard, which is likely to get you pretty close to threshold or allow you to forage. That said, it's still Mind Rot, and most 3 mana target opponent discard 2 type cards don't perform well in limited. They give you a 2-for-1 in the early game, but the advantage of that 2-for-1 is diminished by the fact that you spent mana to not impact the board. So it ends up being more of a wash than anything. And when you get it late, it has an even smaller impact. So this is probably just a D+, like most Mind Rots. Next up, it's Ravine Raider, which for 1 black is a 1/1 Lizard Rogue at common with Menace. You can pay 1 generic and a black, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If you can drop this on turn 1, it's a good way to get your, if your opponent lost life this turn, stuff going as early as turn 2, as a little Menace guy is likely to get in quite easily on turn 2 and maybe turn 3 too. Throw in the ability to buff itself, and we're talking about a little critter that stays relevant all game long, although he's certainly the most impactful early. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Rotten Mouth Viper, which for 5 generic and a black is a 6/6 elemental snake at mythic rare. As an additional cost to cast it, you can sacrifice any number of non-land permanents, and it costs 1 generic less to cast for each permanent sacrificed this way. When it enters or attacks, you put a blight counter on it. Then for each blight counter on it, each opponent loses 4 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent or discards a card. Even if you could only ever cast this for 6, it would be pretty good, since it immediately gives you an effect. And sure, that effect isn't the scariest when your opponent can choose the least impactful of 3 options, but if they don't deal with the Viper immediately, they're also going to be staring down 2 triggers on the next turn while a 6/6 is headed their way. And sometimes you'll have expendable bodies in play that actually let you get this down early, and it is stronger the earlier you can get it down. It is a bit risky to go too crazy there since you put all of your eggs in one basket, and the Viper doesn't come with any sort of meaningful protection against removal, but if you have like 2 random tokens and dropping this on 4 is a possibility, I think you should probably do it. This gets into the lower bomb range for me. Sure, the 1 trigger you get on ETB isn't always going to be a big deal, but it does mean you get something, and if your opponent doesn't kill it before you untap, their chances of winning drop precipitously. I'm giving this an A-. Next up, it's Ruthless Negotiation, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon sorcery. Target opponent exiles a card from their hand. If this spell was cast from a graveyard, draw a card, and it has flashback for 4 generic and a black. So this is ultimately a 2-for-1 most of the time, although by the time you can flash it back, sometimes your opponent won't have any cards. The good news is you still get to draw a card when you flash it back, even if your opponent doesn't have cards. Giving this a C. Next up, it's Savor, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn, create a food token. 2 mana for -2/-2 on an instant isn't premium. It's just a little bit too inefficient and not super easy to trade up with. It does have the upside of being a reverse combat trick of sorts, but that can be a little dangerous. Cranking out a food token is a big deal though, as both black-white and black-green are interested in it. So I think this is a C+ overall. Next up, it's Scales of Shale, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant. This spell costs 1 generic less to cast for each lizard you control. Target creature gets +2/+0 and gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. If this was always a trick that cost 1 mana, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn, it would be like a B level trick, because it offers a buff that is enough for a creature to win most combats, and indestructibility means your creature will survive every combat, and it can also be used in a pinch against removal, and that's without even mentioning the lifelink side of things. However, it is not always going to cost 1 black mana. I'm just trying to convey just how good it is when it will cost that much on occasion. Paying 2 for it isn't a bad deal either. Paying 3 for it kind of is. Like, it's just too much at that point, especially because your opponent can blow you out in response to it if you're not careful. And spending that much mana on something situational also isn't great. So you kind of have to split the difference here. Like, if you are in a deck with like 15 lizards in it, there's a chance this is one of the better cards in your deck. But I don't think it's going to be that easy to make that happen, even in a set with that much typal stuff going on. So I think it's probably right to just give it a C overall. Maybe it deserves like a build around B- grade, but I'm going to start it at a C. Next up, it's Scavenger's Talent, which for 1 black mana is a rare enchantment class. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control die, create a food token. This ability triggers only once each turn. You can pay 1 generic and a black to get it to level 2, and whenever you sacrifice a permanent, target player mills 2 cards, and you can pay 2 generic and a black to get it to level 3. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice 3 other non-land permanents. If you do, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. So the idea here is to get lots of food and sacrifice it to mill yourself so that Chapter 3 gives you something amazing, but that setup is a bit much, and you're far from likely to have a good thing to reanimate, and just getting a food when your creatures die isn't incredible to begin with. There is a lot of food in this set, and lots of food in Graveyard Synergy too, which helps this card's case. It may even be possible to mill out your opponent with this at times, but overall it probably is better to go after it yourself. That said, I think it's probably too slow to be meaningful in the format. I don't think you'll play this most of the time. Sometimes maybe you end up in a deck where you can make it work, but I'm going to give it a D+. Next up, it's Season of Loss, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a mythic rare sorcery. It says choose up to 5 paw prints worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. For 1 paw print, each player sacrifices a creature. For 2, draw a card for each creature you control that died this turn. And for 3, each opponent loses X life, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. The first mode is symmetrical and will often be Wrath of God-esque if you just choose it 5 times. And Season of Loss helps you break the symmetry if you choose other modes. You can turn those dead creatures into cards, or even just make your opponent lose life for the creatures you sacrifice, plus whatever else was in your graveyard. Still, this does feel like it takes a bit of setup to really get going, especially compared to the other seasons. But that's saying something, because the other seasons are all really, really good. I'm giving this one a B+. Next up, it's Sinister Monolith, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, and you can tap it and pay 2 life and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards, activate only as a sorcery. The Drain 1 Life a turn effect has played pretty well in the past. It will get worse if this format is super fast, but the fact that you can play this in your first main phase and drain life right away does mean it does something immediately, and each time 1 life gets drained, you're making life harder for your opponent, whether they're an aggro deck that can't handle the life gain or a slower deck that's being pressured by the life loss. On top of all of that, as I've said numerous times in this video, the black deck likes it when you make your opponent lose life, and the white deck likes it when you gain life and when you pay life, and this checks all of those boxes, because you can cash it in for 2 cards by paying a couple life. Sometimes this will be too slow to be what you need, and you can just use that right away too, which is a nice mode to have. So overall, I think this looks like a pretty nice card, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Stargaze, which for X and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery. Look at twice X cards from the top of your library, put X cards from among them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, you lose X life. This has some serious potential because it can draw you a ton of cards and load your graveyard. Like, if you pay 2 for X, you look at the top 4, lose 2 life, and get 2 cards in your hand and 2 in the graveyard. That's not bad, and if you sink more mana into X, the effect can get better in most ways. The bad news is that it's a sorcery that doesn't add to the board and makes you pay life, which is often a good way to lose the game in Limited. That said, Black-White has the capacity to gain life and pays you off for losing life too, so you are likely to be able to make extra use of this there. And, you know, the graveyard decks might also like this card. And it's definitely something you can cast late on a stable board and pull way ahead, but I still don't love how it's going to perform when you're behind. I think it's probably a C- overall. Next up, it's Starlit Soothsayer, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 bat cleric at common. It's got flying. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained or lost life this turn, surveil 1. Windrake isn't one it once was, and while this is a payoff for a black-white deck, it isn't a very impactful one. It's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Starscape Cleric, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 bat cleric at uncommon. It's got Offspring for 2 generic and a black. It's got flying, it can't block, and whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. Being unable to block can be pretty brutal, because trading off is often the right thing to do in the early game, but this does have pretty efficient stats, and if you've got a way to gain life, which is fairly likely, especially in black-white, this effect is pretty legit. Especially if you also have the Offspring, it can really pile up. Still, the not block part is a big enough downside that I think it tops out at a C. Next up, it's Thornplate Intimidator, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/3 rat rogue at common with Offspring for 3 generic. When it enters, target opponent loses 3 life unless they sacrifice an on-land permanent or discard a card. 4 mana for a 4/3 with this trigger is okay, and it's nice that in the late game you can spend 7 to also get a 1/1 and get the trigger again. And this type of trigger always gets better when you can do it more than once, since your opponent can often choose something for the first trigger that doesn't hurt them too much, but that's harder when you make them make the choice a second time, giving this a C. Next up, it's Thoughtstalker Warlock, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 Lizard Warlock at uncommon with Menace. When it enters, choose target opponent. If they lost life this turn, they reveal their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, and they discard a card. Otherwise, they discard a card. So, 3 mana for a 2/2 Menace that makes my opponent discard a card is already really good. Like, that's a 2-for-1. The Menace body might even prove to be a problem for my opponent in terms of combat. So, having this additional upside where you make the choice about what gets discarded is pretty awesome. Like, I like that you don't feel bad when you don't trigger this. A lot of these cards that say, like, when your opponent has lost life this turn, feel kind of bad if you didn't make that happen. This one's going to feel good either way. It's just going to feel really good when they have. I think this looks great, giving it a B. Next up, it's Valley Rotcaller, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/3 Squirrel Warlock. At rare, it's got Menace. When it attacks, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of other squirrels, bats, lizards, and rats you control. So on its own, this is a 2 mana, 1/3 Menace that drains 1 life when it attacks. And we kind of saw that card at the beginning, but a worse version of it because it didn't have Menace. So obviously, that's a card I'd play, especially with a useful creature type. And your board is often going to have enough creatures that it's draining way more life than that. Even if it doesn't survive an attack, it will often be worth turning sideways. And if it does survive, your opponent might be in a world of hurt. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Wick, the World Mind, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/4 legendary creature rat warlock at rare. When it or another rat you control enters, create a 1/1 black snail creature token if you don't control a snail. Otherwise, put a +1/+1 counter on a snail you control. You can also pay blue, black, and red and sacrifice a snail, and Wick deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to each opponent, then draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. So on its own, this is 4 mana for a 2/4 that makes a 1/1. That's a pretty good rate. I mean, it's not incredible. That would probably be like a C+, but that's a pretty good baseline to have, since all the rest of your rats, when they enter the battlefield, will grow that snail. Or if that snail has died one way or another, including by using Wick's ability, you can get another snail and start all over. And that ability is pretty good. I would say that it's not necessary for you to be able to activate Wick's ability for it to be really good. It'll just be even better if you can cash in that snail. So, you know, if you can pick up a little bit of fixing to make it so you can do it sometimes, you probably should. But it's not crucial that you do either with this card, because most of the value just comes from the 4 mana 2/4 that makes a 1/1 that grows. Like, that's the main thing you have going on here. But obviously, yes, it is better if you can activate this ability. I'm just saying it's not crucial. I think overall it's a B+, and maybe it sneaks into being like an A- if you have really good mana and can sacrifice snails. And our last card is Wick's Patrol, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 5/3 rat warlock at uncommon. When it enters, you mill 3 cards, and when you do, target creature an opponent controls gets -X until end of turn, where X is the greatest mana value among cards in your graveyard. This goes great in this format, because there are 2 graveyard decks in black, and it will usually kill something significant when it enters the battlefield. It is true that if you're foraging with your graveyard a lot, you might not have a high mana value thing left, but this does mill 3 things, so it's likely to at least give something -2/-2, and that's a pretty good card. 6 mana, 5/3, target creature gets -2/-2, but it has a ceiling a lot higher than that, Admittedly, it has a floor on really rare occasions where it doesn't do anything, but that's just not going to happen in this format. Like, the mill trigger alone is likely to prevent that from happening, but your graveyard's also likely to have other cards in it. This may turn on Threshold in addition to killing something. This just looks like a really good uncommon, giving it a B. So those are all the black cards in Bloomburrow. I'll be back next to talk about all the red ones. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch up on the set review videos that are already out, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to catch future set review videos, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget that if you want access to a spreadsheet with all of my grades for this format, you can get it by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.